Behind the comeback everyone celebrated, there is a story of darkness that very few people know the full truth about. What happened in those final moments before everything changed was not some Hollywood miracle or convenient twist of fate. It was something far more raw, far more human, and ultimately far more powerful than any script could capture. This is the story of a woman who carried everything she owned in a cardboard box through a parking lot at dusk, believing her life was over, having no idea that within minutes the entire United States military would be searching for her specifically, desperately, because she was the only person on Earth who could prevent a catastrophe that would reshape the modern world. Sarah Reeves felt the cardboard box cutting deeper into her forearms with each step across the rain-slicked parking lot. The dampness had weakened the bottom, and she could feel it beginning to sag under the weight of 17 years condensed into personal effects. A ceramic mug her daughter had painted in 3rd grade. 3 technical manuals she had written herself. A photograph of her team from back when they still looked at her with respect instead of pity or worse. That careful professional distance that said they knew what was coming and wanted no part of the fallout. The parking lot stretched before her like an ocean, each step taking her further from the building where she had spent the better part of 2 decades, where she had solved problems no one else could solve, where she had quietly, competently, invisibly kept systems running that the entire eastern seaboard depended on without ever knowing her name. The November sky hung low and gray, that particular shade that comes just before full darkness, when the world loses its color and everything becomes shadows and silhouettes. Her feet ached in the low heels she had worn that morning, back when she still thought today might be different, back when she still believed that truth and competence might matter more than politics and liability. The cold seeped through her blazer, but she did not quicken her pace. There was nowhere to rush to anymore. Her car sat in the far corner of the lot, exactly where it always sat, in the space she had parked in every single workday for 17 years. Section C, row 12, 3rd spot from the light post. She knew every crack in that asphalt, every oil stain, every place where water pooled after rain. The box shifted and she had to stop, crouching down to resettle the contents before the bottom gave way completely. Her knees protested. When had she gotten old? 42 should not feel ancient. But somehow in the span of 6 months, she had gone from being the person everyone called when things went wrong to being the person whose name could not be mentioned in meetings. The ceramic mug rolled toward the edge and she caught it, her daughter's painted handprint bright against the white surface. Emma had been 8 then, so proud of her creation. She was 21 now, in her senior year at college, and Sarah had no idea how she was going to explain this. How she was going to tell her daughter that everything they had planned, the graduation trip to Europe, the down payment help for Emma's first apartment, all of it was gone now because Sarah had made the catastrophic mistake of being right when her superiors needed her to be wrong. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and distant traffic and something else, something like ozone or electricity. She stood, lifting the box again, feeling the cardboard bend and protest. 50 feet to her car. She could make 50 feet. She had walked further carrying heavier burdens. She had worked 36-hour shifts when the system needed her. She had stayed calm when alarms screamed and other people panicked. She had solved problems that existed only in theoretical papers. And now she was walking across a parking lot at dusk carrying a box of personal belongings. Because she had told the truth about a system vulnerability that could kill thousands of people, and her superiors had decided that acknowledging the vulnerability was more dangerous than leaving it in place. The military had contacted her directly 3 months ago, not through official channels, not through her chain of command, but directly. A Commander Chun from Naval Systems. Command had called her personal cell phone on a Saturday morning while she was grocery shopping. She remembered standing in the produce section, phone pressed to her ear, listening as Commander Chun explained that they had detected anomalous patterns in the Eastern Seaboard power distribution network, patterns that suggested either a sophisticated foreign attack or a catastrophic system vulnerability. They had tried working through official channels with Consolidated Energy Solutions, her employer, but had received only reassurances and corporate deflection. Someone in the Pentagon had found her name, attached to technical papers published years ago, papers that demonstrated an understanding of power grid architecture that went far beyond standard industry knowledge. Could she help them? Not officially, Commander Chun had emphasized. Just a conversation between professionals, just her expert opinion. She should have said no. She should have understood what that call really meant, what it would cost her. But she had listened to Commander Chun describe the anomalies, and she had recognized immediately what they were seeing, not an attack worse. A design flaw in the integration between legacy systems and new smart grid technology. A flaw she had identified and reported 2 years ago. A flaw that her employer had classified as low priority because fixing it would require taking portions of the grid offline and admitting to regulators that their modernization project had introduced new vulnerabilities instead of eliminating old ones. The flaw that would allow a cascade failure to propagate through the entire eastern seaboard in under 4 minutes if triggered under specific load conditions. The flaw that could leave 80 million people without power in the middle of winter. She had told Commander Chun everything. She had sent him her original report, the one that had been buried in committee reviews and risk assessments. She had walked him through the technical details, the specific scenarios that could trigger the cascade, the warning signs they should watch for. She had done it because it was the right thing to do, because she had taken an oath when she became a licensed engineer to protect public safety above all other considerations. Because she could not live with herself if she stayed silent and people died. Consolidated Energy Solutions had fired her exactly 2 weeks later. Not for talking to the military. They were too smart for that, too aware of the legal implications. They fired her for violations of company policy regarding external communications, for sharing proprietary technical information without authorization, for creating a hostile work environment by persistently raising concerns that had been thoroughly reviewed and addressed by appropriate personnel. They had done it quietly, professionally, with a severance package that was generous enough to make litigation impractical, but not so generous as to suggest guilt. They had done it with careful documentation and multiple witnesses, and absolutely no acknowledgement of the real reason she was being walked out of the building with security escort and a cardboard box. The box was definitely going to give way before she reached her car. She could feel the bottom separating, could hear the subtle tearing sound of wet cardboard losing its structural integrity. 20 feet to go. She shifted her grip, trying to support the bottom with her forearms, but that just made the contents shift again. The technical manual slid toward one corner. Her coffee mug, the good one, with the thermal insulation, clinked against the picture frame. Everything she had built, everything she had accomplished, reduced to objects that could barely fit in a failing cardboard box. The first sound was so subtle she almost missed it. A low thrumming that she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. She stopped walking, trying to identify the source. Not thunder, to steady, to mechanical. Not traffic, to deep, to purposeful. The thrumming grew louder, and she felt it now, in the ground beneath her feet, a vibration that made the water in the parking lot puddles shiver in concentric circles. Other people were emerging from the building behind her, faces turned upward, conversations stopping mid-sentence. The wind hit next, sudden and violent, whipping her hair across her face and making her stagger. The box lurched in her arms, and she clutched it tighter, bending forward against the sudden gust. Papers were flying from somewhere, spiraling up into the darkening sky. Car alarms began to wail. The thrumming had become a roar now, deep and powerful. The sound of massive engines pushing against physics itself. She looked up, and her brain struggled to process what her eyes were seeing. 3 Black Hawk helicopters, flying in tight formation, were descending directly toward the Consolidated Energy Solutions parking lot. Not passing over, descending. She could see every detail now. The olive drab paint, the door gunners in their positions, the sensor arrays, bristling from the fuselages. The rotor wash was hurricane force, bending the small trees planted along the parking lot perimeter, sending trash and leaves and loose papers into violent spirals. The sound was overwhelming, drowning out car alarms and shouts and everything else. She stood frozen, the box forgotten in her arms, watching as the lead helicopter flared and settled into a hover just 20 feet above the parking lot's surface, directly between her and the building. The door gunners were not manning weapons. They were scanning the parking lot with binoculars, heads moving in systematic search patterns. She saw one of them point, saw him speak into his helmet microphone. The helicopter adjusted its position, rotating slightly, and suddenly she realized, with a cold shock that ran through her entire body, that they were looking for someone specific. The other two helicopters had taken up positions flanking the building entrances, and soldiers were fast roping down, boots hitting asphalt with practiced precision. They wore full tactical gear, weapons held in ready positions, faces obscured by helmets and visors. They moved with the efficiency of people who had done this exact thing hundreds of times. The lead helicopter was descending further now, and she could see someone in the crew door. Someone in a different uniform. Someone who was not tactical team, but command staff. An officer. The helicopter touched down with a surprisingly gentle bump, and the officer jumped out before the skids had fully settled, followed by four soldiers who immediately established a perimeter. The officer was a woman, Sarah realized, tall and moving with absolute authority, and she was walking directly toward the building entrance, where a crowd of Consolidated Energy Solutions employees had gathered, faces pale with shock. Sarah stood perfectly still, the box cutting into her arms, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. This could not be happening. This did not happen in real life. Military helicopters did not land in corporate parking lots. Tactical teams did not fast rope onto civilian property. None of this made sense, unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. Unless the thing she had warned about, the thing her employers had insisted was a low-priority concern, had actually happened. The officer reached the crowd at the building entrance, and Sarah could see her speaking, could see head shaking, could see the officer's body language shift from inquiry to frustration. The officer turned, scanning the parking lot, and Sarah saw her pull out a tablet, saw her look at it, then look up again, and this time the officer's gaze locked directly onto her. The officer said something sharp into her radio, and every soldier in the parking lot turned to look in Sarah's direction. The box chose that moment to give way completely. The bottom separated and everything fell, technical manuals hitting the wet asphalt with heavy slaps. The ceramic mug shattering, papers scattering in the rotor wash. Sarah stood there with empty cardboard in her hands, watching as the officer and four soldiers began walking toward her with long, purposeful strides. Behind them, more personnel were emerging from the helicopters, and she could see vehicles entering the parking lot, military police Humvees with light bars flashing. The officer reached her first, and Sarah saw the name tape, Chun, Commander Chun, the woman who had called her 3 months ago while she was grocery shopping. Commander Chun's face was tense, her jaw set, and when she spoke her voice cut through the helicopter noise with parade ground clarity. Sarah Heevis. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice, still holding the empty cardboard box, like it might protect her from whatever was happening. Ma'am, I'm Commander Patricia Chun, Naval Systems Command. We need you to come with us immediately. There's a situation developing, and you're the only person who can help. U.S. Sarah found her voice, though it came out smaller than she wanted. What kind of situation? Commander Chun glanced at the soldiers, then back at Sarah. And Sarah saw something in her eyes that made her blood run cold. Fear. This woman, this military officer surrounded by armed soldiers and helicopter gunships, was afraid. The cascade failure you warned us about. It's happening right now. We have maybe 90 minutes before the entire eastern seaboard loses power, and we can't stop it, because the people who should know how to stop it are insisting there's no problem. Your former employers are telling us their systems are functioning normally, that our readings are incorrect. that we need to stand down and let them handle it through proper channels. But we've been monitoring the propagation pattern and it matches exactly what you predicted. Exactly. We need someone who actually understands these systems, someone who can tell us the truth, and we need them right now. Sarah looked past Commander Chun at the building where she had worked for 17 years, where her former colleagues were gathered in the entrance watching this unfold, where the executives who had fired her were probably having emergency meetings about liability and public relations. She looked at the scattered contents of her cardboard box, at the shattered mug with her daughter's handprint, at the technical manuals she had written lying in puddles. She looked at Commander Chun and the soldiers, and the helicopters, at the sheer impossible scope of what was happening. They fired me, Sarah said, 2 weeks ago, for talking to you, for telling you about the vulnerability. They said I violated company policy. Commander Chun's expression hardened. I know. We've been trying to reach you, but your phone's been disconnected. We went to your apartment, but you'd already left for work. Ma'am, I need you to understand something. This is not a request. This is a national security emergency. The president has been briefed. FEMA is standing by. Hospitals are being notified. We are looking at a potential catastrophe that could affect 80 million people. And you are the only person we've found who actually understands both the old infrastructure and the new integration protocols well enough to guide us through stopping this. Will you help us? Sarah looked at her again, at the fear and the determination and the absolute certainty that what she was saying was true, somewhere in her mind. Sarah was still processing the impossibility of it all, still trying to reconcile the mundane humiliation of being fired with the surreal intensity of military helicopters and national emergencies. But another part of her, the part that had spent 17 years solving impossible problems, the part that had stayed calm when systems failed and alarms screamed, that part was already moving, already thinking, already running through the cascade failure scenarios and the possible intervention points. I need to see your data, Sarah said. The propagation pattern, the current load distribution, the integration points where old and new systems interface. I need real-time access to grid monitoring, and I need communication with the regional control centers. Commander Chun's face transformed, tension releasing into something like hope. We have all of that. We have a mobile command center set up at Naval Station Norfolk. We can have in fifths while you call me. Sarah dropped the empty cardboard box. It fell into a puddle, collapsing completely. Just another piece of trash in a parking lot. She looked one more time at the building where she had given 17 years of her life, where she had been right and been punished for it, where people who knew the truth had chosen politics over safety. Then she looked at Commander Chun and nodded. Let's go. The soldiers moved immediately, forming a protective box around her as they walked toward the lead helicopter. Sarah was aware of faces watching from the building, aware of how this must look, aware that tomorrow the news would be full of speculation and theories. But right now, in this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that somewhere in the vast interconnected web of the Eastern Power grid, a cascade failure was propagating through integration points that should never have been vulnerable. And she was the only person who had actually read the technical specifications closely enough to understand why. The helicopter was even louder inside, the turbine whine mixing with the rotor noise into something that made conversation impossible. A crew chief handed her a helmet with built-in communications, helped her strap into a seat, and then they were lifting. The parking lot dropping away below them. Sarah could see her car, still sitting in its usual spot. She could see the scattered contents of her cardboard box, already being blown around by the rotor wash. She could see the building getting smaller, and the people, and everything that had been her entire world until about 5 minutes ago. Commander Chun's voice crackled in her helmet. We're going to bring you up to speed en route. Dr. Marcus will brief you on what we've observed so far. Another voice, male, older, with the careful precision of someone who dealt in facts and data. Ms. Reeves, I'm Dr. Henry Marcus, Department of Energy. We first detected anomalous load patterns approximately 4 hours ago. Initial assessment suggested normal peak demand fluctuation, but the pattern didn't match historical data. We ran predictive models, and they showed increasing probability of cascade failure. But the confidence intervals were too wide for us to justify emergency action. Then about 90 minutes ago, we had our first actual failure. A substation in Northern Virginia went offline. Standard protocols should have isolated it and rerouted load. Instead, the load redistributed in a pattern that amplified stress on adjacent integration points. Sarah closed her eyes, visualizing the grid architecture, seeing in her mind the way the systems were connected, the way legacy infrastructure interfaced with new smart grid technology through conversion, protocols that had never been properly tested under stress conditions. The integration points, she said. The failure didn't propagate through the primary distribution network. It propagated through the monitoring and control systems. Silence on the radio for a moment. Then Dr. Marcus again, and she could hear the surprise in his voice. That's exactly what we're seeing, but that shouldn't be possible. The monitoring systems are isolated from the power distribution systems. They're supposed to be isolated, Sarah said, but the smart grid modernization project created dependencies. The new systems need real-time data from the old systems to optimize load distribution. That means communication channels, and communication channels mean potential failure propagation paths. I wrote a report about this 2 years ago. The isolation protocols aren't actually isolating anything because the optimization algorithms require continuous data exchange. We need to see that report, Dr. Marcus said. Consolidated Energy Solutions has it. They classified it as proprietary and buried it in committee review. But I can walk you through the technical details. The key issue is that the optimization algorithms were designed assuming perfect data reliability. They don't have adequate error handling for scenarios where the monitoring systems themselves are compromised. So, when that substation in Northern Virginia failed, it didn't just stop sending data, it started sending corrupt data. And the optimization algorithms, instead of recognizing the data as corrupt, tried to respond to it as if it was real. That's what's creating the cascade. The system is trying to optimize load distribution based on information that doesn't reflect reality. And every optimization decision is making the actual situation worse. Commander Chun's voice. Can we shut down the optimization algorithms? Not without potentially making things worse. The old manual control systems were decommissioned as part of the modernization. We're dependent on the algorithms now. Shutting them down completely would leave us with no load management at all. We need to isolate the corrupt data sources and force the algorithms to fall back to historical pattern, matching instead of real-time optimization. Can you do that? Sarah opened her eyes, looking out the helicopter window at the darkening landscape below, at the lights of houses and businesses and hospitals and schools, at 80 million lives that depended on systems most people never thought about until they failed. I can try, but I'm going to need direct access to the primary control systems, and I'm going to need authorization to override safety protocols, and I'm going to need your former employer to stop insisting everything is fine, because every minute they spend denying there's a problem is a minute we're not solving it. The helicopter was descending now, and Sarah could see Naval Station Norfolk spread out below, could see the mobile command center, a cluster of vehicles and equipment and personnel all focused on a crisis that most of the country didn't even know was happening yet. They touched down and Commander Chun was already moving, unstrapping and jumping out before. The skids had fully settled. Sarah followed, legs unsteady after the flight, the noise and confusion overwhelming. The command center was actually a semi-trailer, sides extended out to create more interior space, filled with screens and computers and people moving with urgent purpose. Dr. Marcus was there, older than she had expected, gray hair and tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at her the way drowning people look at life preservers. "Show me what you've got," Sarah said. The next 20 minutes were a crash course in crisis management at the federal level. Dr. Marcus walked her through the monitoring data, and it was worse than she had feared. The cascade wasn't just propagating through the integration points. It was accelerating. Each failure created corrupt data that confused the algorithms further, and the algorithms' attempts to compensate were creating stress on systems that had been stable. She could see it in the graphs, the way the load patterns were becoming increasingly chaotic, the way the safety margins were narrowing. "We have maybe an hour," she said, studying the propagation model. "After that, we'll start losing major substations, and once we lose those, the cascade becomes unstoppable. We need to identify which integration points are sending corrupt data and isolate them from the optimization network. But we can't just isolate all of them because then we lose visibility into the actual grid state. We need to be selective." "How do we identify which ones are corrupt?" Dr. Marcus asked. Sarah pulled up the data feeds, scanning through the numbers with practice speed. "The corrupt data will have characteristic signatures. The monitoring systems have physical limitations on how fast they can respond to changes. Corrupt data will show response times that violate those physical constraints. We're looking for data feeds that show impossible rates of change." She started flagging feeds, working through the list with mechanical efficiency. Her hands moved across the keyboard with muscle memory developed over thousands of hours of system analysis. Around her, military officers and government officials watched in silence, and she was aware that she was being evaluated, that her competence was being measured against the stakes, that if she failed here, the consequences would be catastrophic. But she had lived with pressure before. She had worked in environments where mistakes killed people. This was just bigger. "There," she said, highlighting a cluster of data feeds from substations in the Baltimore-Washington corridor. "These are showing load fluctuations that would require physical impossibilities. The integration points are reporting these fluctuations as real, and the algorithms are trying to compensate. We need to isolate these feeds and force the algorithms to use historical patterns for these regions instead." "Will that stop the cascade?" Commander Chun asked. "It should stop it from accelerating. But we've still got the original failure in Northern Virginia, and we need to address that before we can start recovering. The problem is that the optimization algorithms have created a load distribution pattern that's dependent on the corrupt data. When we isolate those feeds, the algorithms are going to try to rebalance the load. And that rebalancing could trigger additional failures if we're not careful." Dr. Marcus was already on the phone, talking to someone at the Department of Energy, getting authorization for the interventions. Sarah kept working, building a sequence of isolation commands that would minimize the rebalancing shock. It was like diffusing a bomb where every wire was connected to every other wire, where cutting the wrong one in the wrong order would detonate the whole thing. Commander Chun's radio crackled. "Commander, we have a problem. Consolidated Energy Solutions is refusing to implement the isolation protocols. They're saying the protocols will cause unnecessary disruption and that their internal systems show no indication of cascade failure. They're threatening legal action if we force implementation." Sarah looked up from the screen, and the anger that had been simmering since she was fired, since she was walked out of the building with a cardboard box, since she was told that her truth was less important than corporate liability, that anger crystallized into something cold and focused. "Put them on speaker," she said. Commander Chun looked at her. "Nadad." A moment later, a familiar voice filled the command center. Richard Hartman Sr., Vice President of Operations, the man who had sat across from her in the termination meeting and explained with practiced corporate sympathy that her services were no longer required. "This is Richard Hartman, Consolidated Energy Solutions. To whom am I speaking?" "This is Sarah Reeves," she said, and she heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end. "The person you fired 2 weeks ago for. Trying to warn you about exactly what's happening right now. The cascade failure is real, Mr. Hartman. It's propagating through the integration points exactly as I predicted in my report 2 years ago. We have less than an hour to stop it, and you need to authorize implementation of the isolation protocols immediately. Ms. Reeves, you are no longer employed by this company, and you have no authority to access our systems or make operational recommendations. Our internal monitoring shows normal operations. What you're describing is not supported by our data. Sarah pulled up the feed from Consolidated Energy Solutions' own monitoring systems. The feed they were apparently looking at, and she saw immediately what the problem was. Their monitoring was only showing the primary distribution network. They weren't seeing the cascade propagating through the control systems because they weren't looking at the right data. Mr. Hartman, your monitoring is showing you what you want to see, not what's actually happening. The cascade isn't in the primary distribution network yet. It's in the monitoring and control systems. By the time it shows up in your primary distribution monitoring, it will be too late to stop. You need to look at the integration point data feeds. You need to look at the optimization algorithm behavior. You need to trust that I actually know what I'm talking about. We have a team of highly qualified engineers reviewing the situation, Ms. Reeves. They have assured me that there is no immediate danger and that external intervention would be counterproductive. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to speak with whoever is actually in charge there. Sarah looked at Commander Chun, who looked at Dr. Marcus, who looked at someone else in a suit who had been standing quietly in the corner. The suit stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who was used to being obeyed. Mr. Hartman, this is Deputy Secretary Morrison, Department of Energy. Under the authority granted by the Defense Production Act and the National Emergencies Act, I am hereby ordering Consolidated Energy Solutions to implement the isolation protocols as specified by Ms. Reeves. This is not a request. This is a direct order backed by federal authority. You will comply immediately or you will face criminal charges for obstruction of national security operations. Do you understand? Silence on the line. Then, quieter, less certain. I need to consult with our legal team. You have 5 minutes, Deputy Secretary Morrison said. After that, we will implement the protocols with or without your cooperation, and you will answer to a federal grand jury about why you prioritized corporate liability over public safety. 5 minutes. Mr. Hartman, I suggest you use them wisely. The line went dead. Commander Chun looked at Sarah. Can we implement without their cooperation? We have access to the monitoring systems through the federal oversight protocols. We can isolate the corrupt data feeds from our end, but it would be cleaner if they cooperated because they have direct control over the optimization algorithms. If we force it from outside, there's a higher risk of triggering the rebalancing shock I mentioned. How much higher? Sarah pulled up the risk assessment she had been building in her head. Maybe 20%. Not catastrophic odds, but not great either. Dr. Marcus checked his watch. 4 minutes left in Hartman's deadline. After that, we go ahead regardless. Sarah, prepare the isolation sequence for forced implementation. Hope we don't need it, but be ready. Sarah built the sequence, double-checking each step, running simulations in her head of how the system would respond. Around her, the command center had gone quiet. Everyone focused on the screens showing the grid status, showing the cascade still propagating, still accelerating, still marching toward the point of no return. She thought about her daughter, probably in her dorm room right now, studying or watching Netflix or talking with friends, completely unaware that her mother was in a military command center trying to prevent the power grid from collapsing. She thought about all the people in all the houses she had seen from the helicopter, people whose lives depended on infrastructure they never thought about, infrastructure that was supposed to be boring and reliable and invisible. Commander Chun's radio, Commander Consolidated Energy Solutions, is calling back. Richard Hartman's voice, and this time he sounded different, smaller, like someone who had just been informed of consequences he hadn't considered. We will cooperate with the implementation of the isolation protocols. Our legal team has advised that non-cooperation would expose the company to significant liability. We are standing by for instructions." Sarah allowed herself a small, grim smile. Of course, it was liability that changed his mind, not public safety, not the 80 million people at risk, but corporate liability. Some things never changed. "Mr. Hartman, this is Sarah Reeves again. I'm going to walk your operations team through the isolation sequence. It needs to be implemented in a specific order to minimize rebalancing shock. Do you have someone there who can take technical instructions? I'll put you through to our operations center." The next 40 minutes were the most intense of Sarah's life. She guided the Consolidated Energy Solutions operations team through the isolation sequence, step by step, watching the monitoring data as each corrupt feed was removed from the optimization network. The algorithms fought back, trying to rebalance load based on incomplete information. And twice she had to adjust the sequence on the fly when the rebalancing threatened to trigger new failures. Dr. Marcus provided support, confirming her assessments, running parallel simulations. Commander Chun coordinated with regional power authorities, making sure backup systems were ready if things went wrong. And slowly, gradually, the cascade began to stabilize. The propagation rate decreased. The load patterns became less chaotic. The safety margins started to widen. Sarah watched the graphs with the intensity of someone watching a patient's vital signs during surgery, and when the propagation rate finally dropped below the critical threshold, she felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched. "We're stable," Dr. Marcus sighed, and his voice shook slightly. "The cascade has stopped propagating. We're still in a degraded state, but we're stable." Around the command center, people were exhaling, shoulders dropping, faces showing the relief of people who had been holding their breath for hours. Commander Chun looked at Sarah, and Sarah saw something in her expression that she hadn't seen in a long time. Respect, recognition, validation. "Now we need to start recovery," Sarah said, because the crisis wasn't over yet, just stabilized. "We need to bring the failed substations back online in sequence, and we need to repair the integration points that failed. And we need to fix the underlying vulnerability, because this could happen again if we don't address the root cause." "How long will that take?" Deputy Secretary Morrison asked. "Recovery, maybe 12 hours to get back to normal operations. Fixing the underlying vulnerability, months. We need to redesign the integration protocols at better error handling, to the optimization algorithms, implement proper isolation between monitoring and control systems. It's the work I recommended 2 years ago in the report that got buried." Deputy Secretary Morrison looked at her for a long moment. "Ms. Reeves, how would you like a job with the Department of Energy? We could use someone with your expertise on our grid modernization oversight team. Someone who actually understands these systems and isn't afraid to tell the truth about vulnerabilities." Sarah blinked, the offer so unexpected that her brain struggled to process it. A job with the federal government, doing the work she had always wanted to do, the work of actually making infrastructure safer, instead of just writing reports that got buried. She thought about Consolidated Energy Solutions, about Richard Hartman and the executives who had fired her, about the colleagues who had stayed silent. She thought about the cardboard box scattered across a parking lot. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." The recovery took 14 hours, not 12, because they found additional integration points that needed repair. Sarah worked through the night, guiding operations teams at power companies across the eastern seaboard, coordinating with state emergency management agencies, briefing federal officials. She drank bad coffee and ate vending machine sandwiches and worked until her eyes burned and her hands cramped. And somewhere around dawn, when the last substation came back online and the grid was fully operational again, she finally allowed herself to stop. Commander Chun found her in the command center, slumped in a chair, staring at screens that now showed normal operations. "You should get some rest. We have quarters on base where you can sleep." In a minute, Sarah said, "I just want to watch for a little while longer. Make sure it stays stable." Commander Chun sat down next to her. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about what happened to you. I'm sorry that doing the right thing cost you your job. That shouldn't happen in this country." Sarah smiled tiredly. "But it does happen. All the time. People who speak truth to power get punished for it. I knew the risk when I talked to you. I just didn't think they'd actually do it. Well, for what it's worth, you probably saved millions of lives last night. If that cascade had continued, we were looking at weeks of power outages, hospitals on backup generators, water treatment plants failing, transportation systems collapsing. The economic damage would have been in the hundreds of billions, and people would have died. Cold, darkness, failed medical equipment. You prevented all of that. We prevented it," Sarah said. "I couldn't have done it alone. Maybe not. But you were the one who understood what was happening. You were the one who knew how to stop it. That matters." 3 days later, Sarah stood in the parking lot of Consolidated Energy Solutions one more time. Not an employee this time, but as a federal investigator. Deputy Secretary Morrison had moved fast, launching a formal investigation into the company's handling of the Cascade failure and their termination of Sarah for raising safety concerns. The investigation would take months, but the preliminary findings were already damning. Evidence of executives deliberately burying safety reports, documentation of retaliation against whistleblowers, communication records showing they had known about the vulnerability and chosen to ignore it. Richard Hartman was no longer Senior Vice President of Operations. He was unemployed, facing potential criminal charges, and dealing with a lawsuit from shareholders who were not happy about the company's stock price, dropping 40% in 3 days. The CEO had resigned, the board was in turmoil, and the company that had fired Sarah for telling the truth was now facing the consequences of choosing lies. Sarah walked across the parking lot, and this time she was not carrying a cardboard box. She was carrying a federal subpoena and a team of investigators. She walked past the spot where she had dropped a box, where her daughter's ceramic mug had shattered, where she had stood and watched military helicopters descend from the sky. Someone had cleaned up the mess. The parking lot looked normal, boring, like nothing extraordinary had ever happened there. They spent 6 hours in the building, collecting documents, interviewing employees, building the case, and when they finally left, Sarah took one last look at the place where she had spent 17 years of her life. She felt no nostalgia, no regret, no sense of loss. That part of her life was over, and what came next would be better. The news coverage was intense, not right away, because the government had kept the Cascade failure quiet to prevent panic, but when the story finally broke, it dominated headlines for weeks. Military helicopters land in corporate parking lot 2. Find fired engineer who prevented nationwide blackout. The details emerged slowly, leaked by people inside the investigation, reported by journalists who smelled a major story. Sarah's name was everywhere. Her face was on television. Reporters camped outside her apartment. She hated the attention, but she understood its purpose. The story was too good, to perfect a narrative of corporate greed versus individual courage, to clear an example of what happened when institutions prioritized profit over safety. It needed to be told. People needed to understand that infrastructure was not boring, that the invisible systems they depended on were vulnerable, that the people who maintained those systems deserved respect and protection when they spoke up about problems. Emma came home from college for Thanksgiving, and they sat together in Sarah's apartment, now paid for by her new federal salary, eating takeout and watching news coverage of the investigation. Emma had been shocked when Sarah first told her what happened, proud and scared and amazed all at once. Now she just seemed thoughtful. "Mom," Emma said, "were you scared? When they fired you, before the helicopters came, were you scared about what would happen?" Sarah thought about it, remembered walking across that parking lot at dusk, carrying everything she owned in a cardboard box, believing her life was over. "Yes," she said. "I was terrified. I thought I had destroyed everything. My career, our financial security, my reputation. I thought doing the right thing had cost me everything that mattered. But it didn't. No, it didn't. But I didn't know that at the time. That's the thing about doing the right thing. Honey, you have to do it even when you don't know if it will work out. You have to do it because it's right, not because you're sure you'll be rewarded for it." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm proud of you, Mom. I know I don't say it enough, but I'm really proud of you." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes and pulled her daughter into a hug. This, she thought, this was what mattered. Not the job title or the news coverage or the investigation. This moment, with her daughter, knowing that she had shown her what it meant to stand up for what was right, even when it cost everything. 6 months later, Sarah stood in a conference room at the Department of Energy headquarters in Washington, presenting her recommendations for grid modernization reform to a room full of officials and industry representatives. Some of those representatives were from Consolidated Energy Solutions, which had survived the scandal but barely, restructured and under new management. They listened to her presentation with careful attention, taking notes, asking technical questions. The dynamic had changed. She was not an invisible technician anymore. She was the person who had prevented a catastrophe, and when she spoke about infrastructure vulnerabilities, people listened. Her recommendations were comprehensive, new protocols for integration between legacy and modern systems, better error handling in optimization algorithms, stronger whistleblower protections for engineers who raised safety concerns, independent oversight of utility company safety programs, mandatory reporting of system vulnerabilities, criminal penalties for executives who buried safety reports. Some of the industry representatives pushed back, argued about costs and feasibility and regulatory burden. But they pushed back carefully, respectfully, because they knew the alternative was more federal regulation, more oversight, more consequences. The balance of power had shifted. After the presentation, Deputy Secretary Morrison pulled her aside. "That was excellent work. Sarah, the Secretary wants to meet with you next week to discuss implementing these recommendations as part of a broader infrastructure safety initiative. We're talking presidential executive order, congressional testimony, major policy changes. You ready for that?" Sarah thought about it. A year ago, she had been walking across a parking lot at dusk, fired and humiliated, carrying everything she owned in a cardboard box. Now, she was being asked to help reshape national infrastructure policy. The scale of the change was dizzying. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." The executive order came 2 months later, signed by the president in a ceremony that Sarah attended along with Commander Chun and Dr. Marcus and Deputy Secretary Morrison. The order established new federal oversight of critical infrastructure, created stronger whistleblower protections, and mandated regular safety audits of integration between old and new systems. It was named the Reeves Protocol, after her, and that felt strange and humbling and right all at once. The congressional testimony was harder, facing a committee room full of senators and representatives, cameras recording every word, knowing that anything she said could be used against her or twisted or misunderstood. But she told the truth, the same truth she had always told, about vulnerable systems and buried reports, and the cost of prioritizing short-term profit over long-term safety. Some committee members were hostile, accused her of exaggerating the danger, suggested she had manufactured the crisis to advance her career. But others were supportive, praised her courage, demanded accountability from the companies that had failed. And through it all, Sarah kept working. She joined the team redesigning integration protocols. She consulted with utilities implementing the new requirements. She trained engineers on how to identify and report vulnerabilities. She built the systems that would prevent the next cascade failure, the next disaster that could have been avoided if someone had just listened. A year After the helicopters landed in the parking lot, Sarah received a letter from Consolidated Energy Solutions, not from Richard Hartman, who was facing trial on multiple charges, but from the new CEO, someone brought in from outside to rebuild the company's reputation. The letter was an apology, formal and carefully worded, acknowledging that her termination had been wrong, offering to settle any potential legal claims. It came with a check, a settlement that was generous enough to be meaningful but not so large as to admit catastrophic liability. Sarah deposited the check and used part of it to fund a scholarship for engineering students interested in infrastructure safety. She named it after her daughter, the Emma Reeves Scholarship, for young people who wanted to do the unglamorous work of keeping invisible systems running. The rest she saved for Emma's graduation, for that trip to Europe they had planned, for the down payment on Emma's first apartment. The money that had seemed lost forever was back, transformed into something better. But more than the money, more than the new job or the policy changes or the recognition, what mattered most to Sarah was the message that had emerged from the crisis. The message that competence mattered, that truth mattered, that the people who did the invisible work of maintaining infrastructure deserved respect and protection. The message that doing the right thing, even when it cost everything, was still the right thing to do. She thought about that sometimes. Late at night when she was working on some technical problem, when the work felt overwhelming and the stakes felt too high, she thought about standing in that parking lot at dusk, watching her life fall apart, having no idea that within minutes the world would change. She thought about the choice she had made to tell the truth, knowing it would cost her, doing it anyway because it was right. And she thought about all the other people out there, in their own parking lots, facing their own moments of choice, deciding whether to speak up or stay silent, whether to risk everything or play it safe. She hoped they would choose truth. She hoped they would choose courage. She hoped they would know that even when the cost seemed unbearable, even when the consequences seemed catastrophic, doing the right thing mattered. Because sometimes, when you're carrying a cardboard box across a parking lot at dusk, believing your life is over, that's exactly when the helicopters arrive. That's exactly when the world recognizes that what you knew all along was true. That's exactly when quiet competence becomes impossible to ignore. Sarah Reeves had learned that lesson the hard way, and now she spent her days making sure others would not have to. She built systems that protected whistleblowers. She created protocols that valued expertise over politics. She established oversight that held institutions accountable. She did the work that ensured the next person who told an uncomfortable truth would not end up fired and humiliated, would not have to wait for a national crisis to be vindicated. It was not glamorous work. It was not exciting or dramatic or the stuff of headlines. It was the same kind of invisible, essential work she had always done, keeping systems running, preventing disasters, protecting people who would never know her name. But now she did it with authority, with support, with the knowledge that when she spoke, people listened, and that made all the difference. The cascade failure that almost happened became a case study taught in engineering schools and military academies and policy programs. Students learned about integration vulnerabilities and optimization algorithm failures, and the importance of listening to technical experts. They learned about Sarah Reeves, the technician who prevented a nationwide blackout, who stood up to her employer, who told the truth when it cost her everything. But what they did not always learn, what the case studies sometimes missed, was the human part of the story, the fear and humiliation and doubt, the moment of standing alone in a parking lot, carrying a cardboard box, wondering if doing the right thing had been the worst mistake of her life, the seconds before the helicopters arrived, when the future looked dark and uncertain and full of consequences. That was the part Sarah thought about most. Not the triumph or the recognition or the policy changes, but that moment of uncertainty, that space between doing the right thing and seeing it rewarded, that time when courage meant acting without knowing the outcome. Because that was what real courage looked like. Not certainty, not confidence, not knowing you would win. Real courage was doing the right thing anyway, even when you were terrified, even when it cost everything, even when you could not see how it would possibly work out. Sarah Reeves had shown that kind of courage, and the world was better for it. Systems were safer, policies were stronger, whistleblowers were protected, and somewhere out there, another person facing another impossible choice might hear her story and find the strength to speak up, to tell the truth, to do the right thing even when the cost seemed unbearable. That was her legacy, not the Reeves protocol or the scholarship or the congressional testimony. Her legacy was the message that truth mattered, that competence mattered, that the people who kept invisible systems running deserved respect and protection. Her legacy was the example she had set, the courage she had shown, the choice she had made to stand up when it would have been easier to stay silent. And years from now, when Sarah Reeves was retired and the crisis was a distant memory and new engineers were maintaining systems, she had helped design that legacy would remain. The story of the woman who carried a cardboard box across a parking lot at dusk, who lost everything for telling the truth, who was vindicated by military helicopters and a national crisis, who changed infrastructure policy and protected future whistleblowers and showed the world what quiet, competence, and moral courage could accomplish. It was enough. Sarah Reeves had started that day believing her life was over. She had ended it knowing that her life's most important work was just beginning. And in between those two moments, in the space of a few hours and a Cascade failure and 3 Black Hawk helicopters, everything had changed. Sometimes that is how redemption works. Not slowly, not gradually, but in a single moment of crisis when the truth you have been telling finally, undeniably, becomes impossible to ignore. When the systems you warned about fail exactly as you predicted. When the people who dismissed you realize too late that you were right all along. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, that moment comes with helicopters,